Thank you so much for that introduction. It's very generous. So I was really flattered to receive the invitation to come speak with you. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to kind of write something like this. You know, it's longer than 800 or 1,000 words. It doesn't have to have one through line that can be encompassed in a few characters in a headline. So there's a lot of ideas in it, and it's also just me shooting from the hip. The idea was try to figure out what's going on in our situation. So being in the media has probably always been weird. I can't speak to that because I haven't always been in it, but it's very weird right now. And it's weird in sort of ways that kind of speak particularly to the type of modernity that we find ourselves in. I'm always reminded of like Rimbaud's fascination with carnivals. And the plates on carousels that revolved around and flashed in mirrors and changed really quickly, only giving an impression. That's sort of what it feels like trying to manage headlines now. I used to be an editor. I was an editor during the 2016 primaries and the general. I was an opinion editor at that time. And so our objective every day would be to get some kind of analysis that would help people understand what was going on. And I don't know if we ever succeeded in doing that. I'm still not totally sure what's going on. But moving on to being a writer, sort of a different angle onto that same problem. Now I am trying to help people understand what's going on. And so the first step to that is for me to try to understand what's going on from my point of view, myself. Before I can help explain to anyone else, I have to figure it out. And so that's what this is an effort at. The Peter Gabriel title, hope you appreciate it. I have odd music taste, very eclectic, I would say. And then, obviously, public reason is a reference to Rawls. My husband is also a writer. He has his own think tank. He does lots of policy work. And so the sort of main conflict, every marriage probably has like a big drama, I assume. And ours is that he's a Rawlsian and I hate Rawls. So we've got this, he was my high school debate team captain and was Rawlsian at the time. Even then, I was skeptical. And so we've had this kind of ongoing thing for years and years and years, and now it's mounting into a very complicated thing. And completely in good spirit, I'll win. It just so part of what you're seeing here is a result of me trying to think about the media in this kind of weird moment, and part of it is just a lifetime, short lifetime of arguments over Rawls. So I start out with the question from John 18:38, Quid est veritas? For the jesting Pilate, it's the question that Pontius Pilate poses to Jesus when Jesus says he's the truth. Pilate seems to sort of eminently reasonable, right? He's like hauntingly modern. He's a beleaguered administrator. He's retorting in jest when he's presented with this absurd situation. You can sort of sense his exasperation and almost a kind of wry amusement. That's very Roman of him and also strikes very close to home. It's something that wouldn't all be out of place in a contemporary novel or conversation. It wouldn't be fair to conclude that Pilate has no regard for the truth. The ironic question he raises is the sort of thing that you wouldn't ask unless you suppose the truth to be a subject of sort of weighty and sophisticated inquiry. That's the irony of it. It's funny to ask a madman that thing precisely because it's such an important thing to ask. But neither would it be fair to claim that Pilate has simply given up on the truth in this particular instance. You sort of derive the sense that he has decided in conflicts of this specific type, having been a colonial administrator in this specific place for a while, and having sort of a notorious history of dealing with little outbursts like this, the truth is just beyond him in these kinds of circumstances, in a sort of frustrating way. But he still has to govern, and the truth still exists. It just isn't accessible to him in any form now that will help him govern. The truth has been separated from politics. Pilate takes up a metaphysically neutral approach to going along to get along here in this case. What follows, of course, from that very reasonable decision is one of history's most notorious miscarriages of justice. And I would also suggest that it's a premonition of sorts. It's a foray into what would eventually come to be called political liberalism. Very polemical of me. You can see I've had this argument a few times. In political liberalism, a certain distance is created intentionally between political discourse and what one understands to be, in the most profound sense, true. What occupies that zone between what a person believes to be true and what he or she is capable of advocating for politically is, in Rawlsian terms, public reason. Of public reason, Rawls writes, citizens realize that they cannot reach agreement or even approach mutual understanding on the basis of their irreconcilable comprehensive doctrines. In view of this, they need to consider what kinds of reasons they may reasonably give one another when fundamental political questions are at stake. I propose that in public reason, comprehensive doctrines of truth or right be replaced by an idea of the politically reasonable addressed to citizens as citizens. In other words, because citizens in liberal democracies need to justify certain courses of action to one another in their political advocacy, but cannot expect others to agree with their first principles or even understand them, and these are the ones that pertain directly to the truth, they instead offer other kinds of reasons for their political intentions. Rawls argues that the strict expectation of public reason ought to be limited to sort of judges, jurists, legislators, government administrators, candidates for public office, and their campaign officials. He is emphatic, in fact, that he doesn't envision public reason reigning completely, as in what he calls the background culture, or public discourse at large, as conversations like these or in the media. He expects a full and vibrant discussion about comprehensive doctrines vis-a-vis politics to unfold in the public sphere, just not in the particular domain of politics per se. Rawls also holds that citizens may choose to make declarations to one another about their own comprehensive doctrines or first principles, which would ideally promote mutual trust. But he distinguishes those kinds of statements, which are sort of akin to just showing your hand, from the deliberations that follow, which must be carried out under the aegis of public reason. Charles Larmore has pointed out that there's some unclarity around the margins of Rawls' notion of public reason that developed over his career, and it was something that he did handle systematically, but you can never get a hold of all the questions that come out of a thought that big. And I don't think that our current troubles relate to public reason on the axis of an internal problem. I think internally, logically, it basically works. But I want to follow the following observations, which are experiential in some degree, right? Things that I have picked up on while trying to engage in a kind of public reason. And it's toward understanding the relationship of public reason to our current sort of truth predicament, the problems with establishing truth, the legitimation crisis, whatever you want to call it. Nobody knows what they're doing, and it seems like nothing can be known or communicated. Basically, liberals like Rawls, they have contractarian means of explaining how governments come to licitly hold power. But they have much more difficulty reckoning with the fact that governments also have authority. Under a strictly liberal conception of the state, government authority would issue either from expertise or the sort of sheer gravitas of united sentiment. But it's pretty clear to me that governments possess authority that can neither be explained in terms of expertise or consensus. As a result, political activity carries quite a bit of expressive and educational power. People learn all sorts of unstated norms and so forth from their governments, and they imagine these things to be authoritative, to have authority. It's easy to see in that case how people would come to view the language with which governance is conducted as a highly authoritative language, the best kind of language, because it's the highest thing we do collectively in public life together. The internal logic of liberalism also has a tendency to spread. I have this listed as point 1.5 on my sheet. So just think of it as kind of an aside, but I think it's part of the story here. Jean-Bethke Elshtain was among, I think her name's actually Jean, was actually the best observers of this phenomenon, and it can essentially be summed up under the heading of, if you actually think you're right, you do not think you're provisionally or occasionally right. Not really, even if that is all you set out to be. I'll get into this further in a discussion of Rawls versus Rorty. With Elshtain, what she pointed out was, liberalism started out with this notion that, in terms of, for instance, the separation of church and state, it was a highly institutional, very localized, very specific kind of separation that had to do with priests not holding office and churches not having courts and so on and so forth. But obviously it has sprawled out far beyond that now. So what we think of as separation of church and state is often invoked in terms of speech in places that happen to be owned by the state, even if they're managed locally, and so on and so forth. It has this very diffuse meaning. It's no longer just an institutional thing. It's now something on the inside of us, right? It's something that individual people try to adjudicate in their lives, to have some kind of separation in the way that they think about or conduct themselves in these different spheres of life. And liberalism appears to me anyway to have a tendency to do that. it can start out in sort of highly localized, specific forms and then end up sprawling, which is, I think, is kind of what has happened with public reason. The next point I would make is there's a relationship between speech and thought. I don't fully understand it. I'm not an academic. But suffice to say that teaching people how to speak is in some sense teaching them how to think. I can remember when I was in my theology program talking to my tutor just about words. Because it wasn't even possible for me to understand the things I would need to learn until I actually had the words. And so those had to be learned almost like you teach a child words, right? And then they can go on into understanding how those principles later apply. The language of public reason, whether intentionally or not, teaches people that their comprehensive doctrines are not really fit for the highest activity of communal life. It teaches people that their comprehensive doctrines are sort of inherently private. And I suspect that that has a certain impact on how people think about these principles that they hold. Namely, I imagine if you cannot speak well of something, you can't think well of it either. This is one reason I would propose that many of us now seem to operate under a kind of dual opacity. We're not saying what we really mean, and we're probably not also thinking what we really think, whereas a lot of unclarity is concentrated on the inside and on the outside. The next point is that it doesn't actually seem possible to me to split up background culture and public political culture, at least not anymore. Politics has become the lens through which we engage every aspect of our lives, the arts, religion, and so on. People speculated during the election, I can remember receiving pitches about this, on whether Pope Francis, who's like an elderly Argentinian Jesuit living in Rome, is a Republican or a Democrat. The West Wing is a Democratic show. Duck Dynasty is a Republican one. It's about ducks. Episcopalians are Democrats, evangelicals are Republicans, and I'm talking here about primary identities. Whatever the first principles once were, the order of importance appears now to have been reversed. Nowadays, we access much of what ought to fall outside the strictures of public reason through our political identities, which are formed within the structures of public reason. The language and techniques of our politics inform everything rather than the other way around. I can remember during the election, and even now, people would send us pitches, and these would oftentimes translate into articles about the sort of politics of what their kids were like dressing up for as Halloween, the politics of letting a kid participate in a sport. People love to write about their kids. And I probably will as well once the kid is older. I'm a 2-year-old, so not very political yet, but I'm sure she's getting there. But it became clear to me experientially that people were experiencing their whole lives through politics. And I think that 2016, because it was sort of a surprising outcome, only intensified that syndrome. So the high school kids did the March for Our Lives thing. They're participating in politics. They're obviously very young. There are whole sort of TV shows and genres that are not only understood to have political thought in them, sort of political content in the art itself, but to make a particular thrust towards a particular political group, right? So after Star Wars came out, people wrote about how it was a reflection of the Hillary-Bernie thing, right? The 2016 Democratic primary. And like, I don't doubt it, right? But the fact is you're accessing even your Star Wars through your political identity. That is now first, instead of being second. So the comprehensive doctrines, the truth, the things that you really think, they're now on the other side of public reason. All this means, in my view, is that the gap between the truth and what one is able to express in terms of political advocacy has become widespread, normal, even typical, not merely relegated to specific political processes or institutional roles. This means that day to day we're mostly lying to one another. Backing into our assertions about what ought to be politically based on claims we imagine our opponents will accept or at least respond to. We don't make the kinds of declarations Rawls imagines where when we lay out all our beliefs clearly for our opponents to consider and understand, in part, I think, because we're unsure of them ourselves and certain, anyway, that such things aren't fit for public life. So we're internally and externally distanced from the truth where it comes to discussing politics. There are rightward and leftward incarnations of this kind of political distance from the truth. The rightward incarnation is the theme of the fake news phenomenon, in which conservatives generate and disperse conspiracy theories, false news stories, and so on, which affirm conservative intuitions about politics. The leftward incarnation is the theme of sort of campus outrage, in which left-leaning college kids or faculty or administrators protest or deny or otherwise reject certain claims or classes of claims which would contradict left-leaning intuitions about politics. In each case, the responsible parties likely wouldn't deny that truth exists or that it matters. In fact, I suspect that each side likely believes the opposite side is responsible for the destruction and degradation of truth. That's a claim that you see flows in both directions. The right wing says the left wing lies and that they hide things and that they misrepresent things and that they won't let people tell the truth. Milo Yiannopoulos, who's come up in another talk here, sort of a provocateur figure, his whole thing is that it's impossible to tell the truth and all he's doing is trying to show up and tell the truth. And oddly enough, that is also exactly what the left says. There's a perfect mirror image. You have the March for Science. You have all of these sort of Enlightenment feeling, traditionally liberal statements coming out of the American left right now, having to do with what about facts, what about truth, everyone else is lying except us. Unfortunately, that's what everyone thinks, and I think they're all right. It appears to me that each side is actually attempting to do what public reason dictates, to supply a political reasoning that ought to persuade any right-minded person. When campus protesters claim that AEI scholar Christina Hoff Sommers is a fascist, they are in fact proposing she's anti-liberal, that she is a danger to the liberal order, something even their conservative opponents ought to agree is bad. Likewise, when Alex Jones claims the government is staging shootings to justify the unconstitutional disarming of America, he's correct in thinking that such a disruption of liberal democratic order would be utterly unacceptable, even to the most fervent advocates of gun control. The trouble is that neither party in these cases is saying something true. They're expressing some kind of truth in a performative sense. They're giving voice to whatever their moral intuitions dictate, but they're not, strictly speaking, telling the truth. But then again, that's not what public reason's about. Where it comes to the shabby status of truth in present discourse, nebulous, nameless things are usually identified as the culprits, with postmodernism being one of the off-sided specters, especially the case where mainstream public intellectuals are concerned, sort of likes of Steven Pinker, Leon Wieseltier, Michael Shermer. Most recently, the Canadian psychology professor Jordan Peterson is kind of big on the right now, have all blamed contemporary currents of confusion on postmodernism. They are usually referring to college students being upset about stuff. And it's a pity, right? Because postmodernism is one of the least meaningful terms in public life. By that, I mean it's used to signify such a dizzying array of often contradictory things that it's impossible to know what's meant by it in any given case. At any rate, whatever postmodernism comes up in contemporary mainstream discourse, it doesn't ever bear much argumentative weight. Good authors reveal what they mean by it in a way that usually doesn't match the historical use of the term and would have been clearer without it, and bad authors just don't. Worse yet than postmodernism is the attribution of today's legitimation crisis to Marxism, or cultural Marxism, as argued by Andrew Sullivan, James Trout, and others. The usual Marxian terminology here is even further afield from its traditional application than in the case of postmodernism. Adding to the confusion, many thinkers will often conflate Marxist influences with postmodernism in the same treatises on the same college kids. Though, as writer Shuja Khaider has pointed out, the two ideological camps are quite profoundly opposed. In other words, those who are most concerned by the crisis of truth seem as much at a loss to explain its origins as anyone else. In fact, their narratives about the emergence of our present conditions are themselves confused. I like the phrase, and I think I first read it in a discussion about Hegel, not only confusing, but confused. Fluid terminology and outright contradiction mark these repeated liberal attempts to explain why we're in this post-truth moment. So I don't think their answers are helpful, but I think their anxiety is. And I think where the anxiety is emanating from, and if you look at this list of names, you have Steven Pinker, who just wrote about the Enlightenment, right, Enlightenment Now, Andrew Sullivan, who still describes himself as a classical liberal, Jordan Peterson calls himself a classical liberal. These are liberals in crisis mode, right? And I think that their anxiety is heightened to such a degree because the problem itself is arising out of liberalism, and what they want to protect has a corrosive element inside of it. To put a finer point on it, I suspect that what they understand to be under siege is more revealing with regard to the source of this whole thing than their theories about the origin. So let's take a look at their anxiety. Consider Sullivan. Objective truth? Ha! The culture is now saturated with the concept of your own truth, based usually on your experience of race and gender, he lamented in New York Magazine. So if you wonder why our discourse is now so freighted with fear, why so many choose silence as the path of least resistance, or why the core concepts of a liberal society, the individual's uniqueness, primacy of reason, protection of due process, and objective truth, are so besieged, that is one of the reasons. Or Traub, who asked, how can the quintessentially rationalist faith of liberalism flourish in an age that systematically demeans rationality? Liberalism itself is at risk, in other words, due to the increasing difficulty involved in invoking capital T truth. But I don't think this is a result of illiberal interventions into liberalism. Rather, it appears to me to be the result of liberal innovations on liberalism, which were themselves totally in line with liberal principles. Rawls maintained that his political liberalism was sort of essentially metaphysically neutral. That is, it's capable of encompassing a politics inclusive of many different comprehensive doctrines. As Jeremy Fortier has suggested, one can contrast this version of liberalism, and Rawls did himself, with something along the lines of Enlightenment liberalism, the earlier incarnation of liberalism which held in short that the liberal understanding of how politics ought to be conducted is the true understanding. There was a tight relationship there between the truth and the good. Fortier notably disagrees with Rawls' own analysis of his theory. Liberalism, even in the Rawlsian conception, it does rest on something greater than a rigorous insistence on the state's metaphysical neutrality. There's just more going on there. There really is substantive content in it. It has particular ideas of the good in mind, in other words, which it expresses in terms of reasonability and consensus, though it doesn't actually envision its version of the good to be dependent on either of those things, not fully. There are things you can come up with that are reasonable or vastly consented to that liberalism will reject. And there are likewise things you can come up with that seem somewhat unreasonable or are not vastly consented to that liberalism will nonetheless hold fast to. So there's more going on there than meets the eye. Richard Rorty, on the other hand, took Rawls' general notion of a metaphysically neutral liberalism a step further, and he culminated in what he called postmodern liberalism, a form of liberalism in which truth is simply not relevant to democratic politics. And the question of whether justifiability to the community with which we identify entails truth is simply irrelevant. Truth still exists, it still probably matters in some sense, but it's essentially privatized and it's evacuated from the realm of political discourse. Rorty imagines those conditions will strengthen liberal democracy, among other things, by encouraging the decline of comprehensive doctrines that cause friction with liberal political functioning. He's been right. The result of an ever more liberal liberalism is, in other words, a political culture which places truth claims, at least those not native to liberalism itself, at a greater and greater distance from political deliberation. One could be forgiven under those conditions for sensing that truth really isn't the main subject at hand in politics, and therefore that political discourse is more about certain procedural achievements than a furtherance of the truth towards the good. If truth is an essentially private and essentially submerged and essentially personal matter for personal consideration, then it makes sense that its place in public life will be decentered and destabilized. I don't think this is a good state of affairs, but I think we have significant reasons for suspecting that it's not the result of postmodern or Marxian intrusions upon liberalism, but simply a result of liberalism itself doing what it does. So what does this mean for journalism? Journalism has, and it's very impressed with its role in liberal democracy. Trust me. The journalism is quite aware of the purpose it serves in liberal democracy, and there is a role for sort of independent organs which report information to people who otherwise just wouldn't have access to it. But what are we to do about the fact that it really seems to be a problem for the liberal order to keep opening the gap wider and wider between what we actually think is true and what we are able to say in public life? And that the gap is also extending inside, that people don't usually seem to fully understand what they think to be true. They have intuitions and they have some ideas, but they seem to even be lacking good language to describe to themselves what it is they believe in a comprehensive sense. I know this. People hate being lied to, and they know they're being lied to. And with the way that public reason functions, with the way that we debate politics now, everyone knows they're being lied to all the time. That is why if you watch liberal media or conservative media, the one thing they go on and on about is hypocrisy. Over and over again. Every day you can find a news segment just about hypocrisy. Democrats say they want women in office. See, 2016, Hillary Clinton. What about Gina Haspel? She's a woman. Why can't she be in office? This was done over Sarah Palin as well. And these are arguments which could be resolved if someone was willing to say, like, no, that's not actually what I think. My comprehensive thing, this actual belief I have, is somewhat different than that. I just put it that way because it's a sort of publicly neutral thing that I can expect an opponent to respond to. You could resolve all those accusations of hypocrisy, but you wouldn't really be in much better condition, I don't think. But I suspect that a lot of the hostility and the cynicism and the mistrust with which people approach each other in our democracy now has to do with that feeling that they are constantly being lied to, and perhaps with the feeling that they're constantly lying, which is also the other side of it. So I think people need to know their own comprehensive doctrines better. I don't know how to do that. Maybe journalism or sort of public intellectualism, to the degree that that can still exist, is a part of that. That's sort of what I try to do. I try to understand my own comprehensive doctrines as well as I possibly can. And the other thing I do that I think might be important is I also make the kinds of declarations that Rawls talks about. My cards are always on the table. If you want to Google, you can find long essay about why I converted to Catholicism, why I'm a socialist. And I'm very open and I'm very specific about terms. And I will say, I think this because I think X is evil. And I really, really am trying to get you down to the very basic kernel of why I think what I do. Now, it comes off weird in public life because people don't usually say that kind of thing. They won't just say, like, well, foundationally, I think people are contemplative creatures and that the end of human life is a union with the will of God. But I'm more than happy to say that, right? And then I can go step by step all the way through there to whatever political issue that's probably pretty quotidian that we're discussing, how I rule on it. But I never want people to feel like I'm doing some kind of hide the ball game with them, or I think something but I'm not saying it, and I'm trying to convince them but I'm not being fully honest. So I think honest brokerage is important, and one of the issues with it is that because of public reason, because of the importance of this kind of metaphysical neutrality in political discourse, the media is very resistant to it. Everyone has these things going on inside them. And I would propose that we all be open about them, which is a position a lot of other journalists have as well, and many who are in more traditional reporting roles than I am. But I think that kind of honesty is important because, and this is in Rawls' own explanation of why those kind of declarations are important, because they build trust. So the legitimation crisis, the crisis of truth, the constant accusations of hypocrisy and bad faith, which are accurate, they all come down to, on an emotional level, a total lack of trust, complete cynicism about everyone else around you, which translates into a cynicism and a mistrust of institutions, of democracy itself. You can see all of those things on the uptick in polls, especially of younger people. And so there has to be some way to reestablish a kind of trust. And I think a component of that, probably not the full extent, but a component would be a greater familiarity with our own comprehensive doctrines and a greater honesty about them. Then we either need to limit politics to the political and try to create non-political space where that kind of trust can unfold, or failing that, come up with some kind of political discourse that is persuasive but not deceptive. And that might be even more difficult. It could just translate into people having really interesting arguments. Liberalism sort of envisions that those will give way to violence because there are simply irreconcilable differences right there that can't be worked out. Perhaps that's the case. I certainly don't want that, but it doesn't seem like we're getting to a much better place with what we're trying right now. And so maybe this all comes with just a declarative bent. That's what I've adopted, and maybe it comes with an educational bent, and maybe it comes with a kind of call to conceptualize in very clear and very broken down terms what we're talking about when we talk about politics, what we talk about when we're talking about the truth. But ultimately my conviction here is that the displacement of the truth from the good, and the truth from what you advocate politically, and the truth from what you actually think about, that distance that's opened up there, I think, is a big part of the problem. And I think it's contributing to a lot of sort of negative emotions and difficulties with managing our democracy. I think the media has a role in solving it, and I hope it can be resolved. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. Thanks very much.